Hey everybody, my name is Damon Knight and welcome to my channel and to our continuing series on A Complete Noob's Guide to Astrophotography. As always, if you haven't seen the previous videos in this series, I do really recommend you go back and check them out. There's a lot of groundwork and foundational knowledge that we're trying to build up here, so those previous videos will help things make more sense as we go. Today, though, we are going to be talking about mounts. This is a topic that can be particularly confusing because outside of astrophotography, they're less of a thing. So this might be your very first exposure to this concept. So we're going to start with just a little bit of background. From our perspective, objects in the sky move through the sky as the night goes on, the day goes on, whatever. All the time things are moving. If you take a camera and stick it just on like a regular tripod and take a picture with an exposure that's more than just a couple of seconds, you're going to start to see star trailing. Just the stars basically start turning into streaks and getting long in your picture. And a mount is a piece of equipment that rotates your camera in some sort of mechanism or some sort of way to try to keep those stars as stars, right? To prevent that trailing. Uh, Now, it's worth noting, of course, that the planets and the sun and the moon move at different rates from the stars and each other, generally speaking. And so a lot of mounts will have settings where you can tell it which type of thing you're taking pictures of, and it'll adjust the mount speed accordingly. It's important to keep in mind that you don't technically need a mount for astrophotography. You can absolutely take short exposures and manually kind of repoint your equipment as needed, but obviously this is fairly time consuming and a pain, especially for things like galaxies and nebula and stars. If you're doing solar or lunar or planetary astrophotography, you can much more reasonably use just a tripod due to the differences in kind of the brightness and speed of movement and the specifics of all that. And if you're just trying to take pictures of the Milky Way, a tripod by itself is totally fine. Matter of fact, hopefully here up on the screen, I'm showing you a picture that I took of the Milky Way just with a tripod and a camera when I was first getting started. So now you at least kind of understand what a mount is and why it's a good thing to have. But it's also important to note that there are different kinds of mounts. As usual, I'm not going to go into a ton of detail here. That'll be saved for future videos, but I do want to cover some of the basics. It's also important to note that a mount does not remove the need for a tripod. A good tripod is always, always, always important. So, getting into the mounts, the first type of mount we're going to talk about is what's called a star tracker. I almost called it a sky tracker. It's a star tracker. These are generally the cheapest, the smallest, and the most basic type of mount. They can generally only hold kind of regular cameras with regular camera lenses. You're going to really struggle to get a proper telescope of any sort on one of these, and they can only generally rotate along one axis, right? They can go left to right, right to left, whatever. And that actually matters, and we can talk more about the details of that in a little bit, but it will broadly, keep the stars relatively in one position for you. But also, they require you to manually aim your camera at whatever it is you want to take pictures of. They are an incredibly common entry point for new astrophotographers due to their low cost. But depending on what you want to do, obviously, their limitations can definitely be an issue. Next up are what are called alt-az mounts, which stands for altitude and azimuth. Those mounts can rotate along two axes, left and right and up and down, and they're most frequently used for either terrestrial photography, things on Earth, or visual astronomy. Not so much for astrophotography. They're designed the way they work will generally cause stars to slowly drift out of your frame. That said, they're pretty light. They don't need counterweights, which is a whole other thing that we'll get into in the future. And you can still use them for like short exposure astrophotography. In addition, some alt-az mounts can be adapted with something called a wedge into something more appropriate for astrophotography. Not all of them, though. It is important you're aware that these mounts exist because you're definitely going to see them when you're shopping for your own mount. Generally speaking, I would not recommend an alt-az mount for astrophotography use. Finally, we have EQ mounts. EQ stands for equatorial, and you might also see them referred to as German equatorial mounts. They're the same thing, just people call them different stuff. These mounts tend to be bigger, more expensive, and heavier than other types of mounts. And EQ mounts, I mean, they can really span the gamut from, fairly affordable to tens of thousands of dollars, depending on how fancy you want to get. Um, they require balancing your equipment properly. They're going to have counterweights, uh, but they're incredibly powerful and have excellent tracking capabilities, which is really what's going to allow you to get into long exposure astrophotography. I've taken 15 or even 20-minute long exposures with my EQ mount, and you can go even higher than that. I think the longest I've done is about 30 minutes. But again, the sky is kind of the limit with those if you've got them dialed in. If you want to take pictures of proper deep space objects and use big telescopes, an EQ mount is going to be what you're going to need. They can rotate on two axes like alt-az mounts, but their design allows them to keep the stars centered in the frame all the time, which is pretty awesome. Most astrophotographers eventually wind up with an EQ mount. So that, very, very briefly, is kind of a quick guide to the different types of mounts. But before we wrap up, there are two more concepts that are going to be important for you to understand, so I want to just kind of briefly go into them. The first is what's called polar alignment. Star trackers and EQ mounts require a good polar alignment to get a good picture. And a polar alignment is just making sure that your mount itself is aimed at Polaris, because that star is effectively what the rest of the night sky for us here, at least in the northern hemisphere. Not sure what southern hemisphere people use, but that's what it kind of rotates around. That's the rotation point of the night sky for us and for our perspective. And again, we'll go into details in the future, but it's important that you are aware that it is a thing. Alt-az mounts, I don't think, need that, just because of the way they work is a bit different. Next up is what's called go-to. You might remember I mentioned how star trackers need to be kind of manually pointed whatever it is you want to take pictures of. With alt-az and EQ mounts, you have options. There are some mounts that are entirely manual in both of those categories, and you have to manually aim them, but there are also go-to mounts. And they are basically just motorized in such a way that you can use a hand controller or a computer or whatever and go, hey, this is the thing in the sky I want to take a picture of. And sometimes that's a planet, or it might be, oh, hey, I want to take a picture of, the Bubble Nebula. And it will automatically point itself at the location of that object in the sky. It's obviously going to be more expensive having go-to versus a manual one, but I tend to think that they're incredibly worthwhile. It's definitely a huge quality of life improvement over a manual mount. So there we go. There are just kind of some of the really basic concepts and terminologies that you're going to need to know about as you progress, and hopefully I've left you with a better understanding of mounts. As always, we're going to keep pushing along to cover more and more topics, and as we go, things are going to get more and more detailed. But for a quick primer, this should give you hopefully enough of a start to know what people are talking about. I'm not sure yet what the topic of the next video is gonna be. We'll figure that out, but do stay tuned and watch for more. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you all again next video.